The summer of 1943 hung heavy over Riverside, California, a small town that had transformed almost overnight into a bustling hub of wartime industry. Where orange groves once stretched toward the mountains, now stood rows of factory buildings where the roar of machinery never stopped. The air smelled of metal and oil instead of citrus blossoms. Every able-bodied person in town worked toward one goal: winning the war against tyranny across two oceans. Margaret Maggie. Sullivan walked through the gates of North American Aviation's factory each morning at 6 o'clock sharp. At 24 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, with dark hair pinned carefully under her work scarf and green eyes that held a determination most people twice her age had never known. She wore coveralls that had belonged to her brother Tommy before he shipped out to the Pacific. They were too large, but she cinched them tight and rolled up the sleeves. She didn't care how she looked. She cared about the work. Maggie was a riveter on the P-51 Mustang assembly line. Her hands, small and precise, drove thousands of rivets into the aluminum skin of fighter planes that would soon fly over enemy territory. Each rivet had to be perfect. Each plane had to be flawless. Lives depended on it. Tommy's life depended on it. But not everyone at the factory saw Maggie the way she saw herself. "Hey, Rosie!" a voice called out from across the factory floor. It was Frank Donnelly, a floor supervisor in his 50s who had worked in aviation before the war. He had a thick mustache and an even thicker attitude about women in the workplace. "You sure you got that rivet gun set right? Don't want you scratching up my planes with those delicate little hands." Maggie didn't look up from her work. She'd heard it all before. Every day, some variation of the same mockery. Too small, too weak, too female. She squeezed the trigger on her rivet gun, and the sharp crack echoed through the factory. Perfect placement. Perfect depth. She moved to the next mark. "I'm talking to you, sweetheart," Frank said, walking closer. Several other workers glanced over. Some looked uncomfortable. Others smirked. "These birds aren't toys. They're fighting machines. Everyone that rolls out of here has to be combat ready. Can't have sloppy work just because we're desperate enough to let women play factory." Maggie set down her rivet gun and turned to face him. Her jaw was tight, but her voice came out steady and calm. "Mr. Donnelly, I've driven 43,000 rivets in the past 4 months. My rejection rate is 0.02%. That's the lowest in this entire section. I don't do sloppy work. I do perfect work. And these aren't your planes. They belong to the pilots who'll fly them against the enemy." Frank's face reddened. A few workers nearby stopped what they were doing to listen. One of them, a young man named Eddie who'd failed his physical for the service, let out a low whistle. "You got a mouth on you," Frank said, stepping closer. "Let me tell you something, little girl. I've been building aircraft since before you were born. I know quality when I see it. And I know when someone's just here to look good in a poster while real workers carry the load." Maggie felt heat rising in her chest, but she kept her face neutral. She'd learned early not to show anger. Anger gave men like Frank exactly what they wanted. Instead, she picked up her rivet gun again. "Then inspect my work, sir," she said quietly. "Any rivet, any seam. If you find one flaw, one single imperfection, I'll transfer to another section. But if my work is perfect, I expect you to stop questioning my ability based on what I look like instead of what I produce." The factory floor had gone quieter now. Even the noise of the assembly line seemed to fade into the background. Frank's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a woman barely old enough to vote. "Fine," he said. He walked to the section of fuselage Maggie had just finished. He ran his hand along the rivets, checking each one with his fingers and eyes. He pulled out a small inspection mirror and examined the inside. He tested the spacing with a gauge. His jaw worked back and forth like he was chewing something bitter. Finally, he straightened up. "It's adequate," he said. Then he walked away without another word. Eddie let out another whistle, this one longer. "Adequate," he repeated with a grin. From Frank, that's like getting a medal, but Maggie knew better. Frank Donnelly wasn't going to leave her alone just because her work was flawless. Men like him didn't operate on fairness. They operated on pride. And she just wounded his. That evening, Maggie walked home through streets that looked strange in their emptiness. So many young men were gone. The ones who remained were either too young, too old, or classified as essential workers. The houses she passed had stars in their windows. Blue stars for sons serving overseas. Gold stars for sons who wouldn't come home. Her own mother had a blue star in the window for Tommy. Just one. Maggie's father had died when she was 12, and Tommy had become the man of the house at 16. He'd worked at the same aviation factory, learning the trade until Pearl Harbor changed everything. He'd enlisted the next day. "You take care of Ma," he'd said before he left. "And Maggie? You're smart. You're capable. Don't let anyone tell you different. This war needs everybody." So Maggie had applied at the factory. She'd learned to rivet. She'd learned to read blueprints. She'd learned to work with tools that felt heavy in her hands at first, but now felt like extensions of her fingers. She worked 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week. She sent most of her pay home to her mother. And every night she wrote letters to Tommy. She didn't know if he received them. Mail service to the Pacific was slow and uncertain. But she wrote anyway, telling him about the planes they were building, about the factory, about Riverside. She didn't tell him about Frank Donnelly or the other supervisors who made her days harder than they needed to be. Tommy had enough to worry about. When Maggie reached her small boarding house on Maple Street, she found a letter waiting in her box. Her heart jumped. But it wasn't from Tommy. It was from the War Department. Her hands shook as she opened it. It wasn't the telegram she feared. Instead, it was a form letter about a new program. The Army Air Forces was looking for civilians with exceptional technical skills to serve as advisors and trainers for maintenance crews overseas. The program was open to men and women. Applicants needed factory experience, high-quality work records, and a willingness to serve near combat zones. Maggie read the letter 3 times. An opportunity to serve. A chance to be closer to the war, to the fight, maybe even closer to Tommy. She could use her skills where they mattered most. She could help keep those Mustangs flying, but she knew what Frank and the others would say. She could already hear the mockery. A woman in a combat zone? Teaching men how to do their jobs? They'd call it ridiculous. They'd call her delusional. They'd say she was trying to play soldier when she should be grateful to have any job at all. Maggie folded the letter carefully and put it in her pocket. She looked at herself in the small mirror by the door. Her face was smudged with factory grime. Her hands were calloused and marked with small cuts that came from working with metal all day. She didn't look like the women in the magazines or the propaganda posters. She looked tired. She looked ordinary. But when she met her own eyes in the mirror, she saw something else. She saw determination. She saw purpose. She saw someone who wouldn't quit. "Tommy said this war needs everybody," she whispered to her reflection. "That includes me." The next morning, Maggie arrived at the factory at her usual time. She worked through her shift with her usual precision. But during lunch break, she walked to the administrative building and asked for an application for the Army Air Force's Civilian Advisor Program. The clerk, an older woman named Dorothy, raised her eyebrows but handed over the forms. "You know what you're getting into?" she asked. "This isn't like working here. You'd be overseas, near the fighting." "I know," Maggie said. "There'll be men who don't want you there. I know that too." Dorothy studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Good luck, honey. We need people with backbone." Maggie took the forms back to her station and filled them out during breaks over the next few days. She needed supervisor recommendations. She asked Eddie, who was technically a junior supervisor, and he agreed enthusiastically. She asked the quality control inspector, a quiet man named Harrison who'd always treated her fairly. He agreed without hesitation. She didn't ask Frank Donnelly. 2 weeks later, Frank called her into his office. Maggie's stomach tightened as she walked through the door. Frank sat behind his desk, and the application forms were spread out in front of him. "What is this?" he asked, tapping the papers. "An application for the advisor program, sir." "I can see that." His voice was dangerously calm. "What I want to know is why you think you're qualified for this. You want to go overseas and teach military mechanics how to do their jobs? You, a girl who's been in this factory less than a year?" "I've been here 11 months, sir. My work record speaks for itself." "Your work record." Frank laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Let me tell you what your work record says to me. It says you're competent at following instructions in a controlled environment. It doesn't say you can handle the chaos of a combat zone. It doesn't say you can command respect from military personnel who've been doing this work since before you were born. And it certainly doesn't say you belong anywhere near the front lines. Maggie kept her voice level. The program is open to qualified civilians. I meet the requirements. You meet the minimum requirements on paper, Frank said. He leaned back in his chair. But here's what's going to happen. Every application from this facility requires a supervisor recommendation. I'm the head supervisor for this section, and I'm not going to recommend you. The words hit like a physical blow, but Maggie didn't let her face change. Why not, sir? My work is exemplary. Because you'd be a liability, Frank said flatly. You'd be a distraction. Soldiers need to focus on fighting, not on babysitting a woman who thinks she can do a man's job in a war zone. I'm doing you a favor, Sullivan. I'm keeping you safe and keeping our fighting men focused. You should thank me. Maggie stood there for a long moment. Everything in her wanted to argue, to fight, to demand fairness. But she'd learned something working in this factory. Sometimes the system was rigged. Sometimes the game was fixed. And sometimes you had to find another way. Is that all, sir? She asked quietly. Frank looked surprised by her calm response. Yes. Get back to work. Maggie walked back to her station. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. From rage, from frustration, from the sheer injustice of being judged not by her abilities but by someone else's prejudices. Eddie noticed her expression. You okay? He asked. Frank won't recommend me for the program. That's garbage, Eddie said. Everyone knows you're the best riveter we have. Doesn't matter. Maggie picked up her rivet gun. Not to him. But as she worked through the afternoon, an idea began to form. Frank Donnelly might be the head supervisor of her section, but he wasn't the only person with authority at North American Aviation. And if there was one thing Maggie had learned from watching Tommy navigate the world, it was that every system had cracks. Every wall had doors. You just had to find them. That night, instead of going straight home, Maggie went to the factory's main administrative building. She asked to see the personnel director, a man named Mr. Charles Whitmore. She didn't have an appointment. She didn't know if he'd see her. But she had to try. The secretary, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked at her with curiosity. Mr. Whitmore is very busy. What is this regarding? It's regarding the Civilian Advisor Program, Maggie said, and a matter of discrimination. The secretary's eyebrows rose. She disappeared into the back office. 5 minutes later, she returned. Mr. Whitmore will see you for 10 minutes. Charles Whitmore was a tall man in his 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His office was lined with photos of aircraft and citations from the War Department. He gestured for Maggie to sit. You have 10 minutes, Miss Sullivan, he said. Use them wisely. Maggie took a breath and began to speak. She told him about her work record. She told him about the application. She told him about Frank Donnelly's refusal to recommend her and the reasons he'd given. She spoke clearly and calmly, presenting facts rather than emotions. When she finished, Mr. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Do you know why I agreed to see you? No, sir. Because my secretary told me you used the word discrimination. That's a serious accusation. He leaned forward. It's also a legal issue. We have government contracts. We're required to follow federal guidelines on employment practices. President Roosevelt's executive order says we can't discriminate in defense industries. So tell me, Miss Sullivan, are you accusing this company of violating federal law? Maggie met his eyes. This was the moment. She could back down, apologize, leave. Or she could stand firm. I'm saying that I'm being denied an opportunity based on my gender, not on my qualifications, she said. If that's not discrimination, sir, then I don't know what is. Mr. Whitmore studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he smiled slightly. You've got courage, I'll give you that. Most people wouldn't walk into this office and challenge a supervisor's decision. He opened a folder on his desk. I've already pulled your personnel file. Your work record is extraordinary. 0.02% rejection rate. Multiple commendations from quality control. Even Frank Donnelly, in his official reports, has marked you as exceeds expectations in technical proficiency. Then why won't he recommend me? Because Frank Donnelly is a good production supervisor and a terrible human being when it comes to change, Mr. Whitmore said bluntly. He doesn't believe women belong in this industry except as temporary wartime help. He's wrong. But he's also been with this company for 20 years and he delivers results. He closed the folder. However, he's not the only person who can recommend you for this program. Hope flickered in Maggie's chest. Sir, I'm the personnel director. I have the authority to make recommendations on behalf of the company. He pulled out a form and began writing. I'm going to recommend you, Miss Sullivan, and I'm going to note in your file that you demonstrated initiative and courage by bringing this matter to my attention. Those are exactly the qualities the Army Air Forces needs in their advisor program. Maggie felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. See that you don't? Mr. Whitmore signed the form with a flourish. And Miss Sullivan? When you get over there, wherever they send you, you remember something. You're not just representing yourself. You're representing every woman who's been told she can't do something because of her gender. Make us proud. I will, sir. I promise. As Maggie walked out of that office, clutching the signed recommendation form, she felt something shift inside her. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. She knew that. There would be more Frank Donnellys, more doubters, more obstacles. But she'd taken the first step. She'd stood up for herself. She'd found a way through, and somewhere across the Pacific Ocean, Tommy was fighting for freedom and justice. Maggie was going to do the same, in her own way, with her own weapons. Not with guns, but with skill. Not with violence, but with excellence. She didn't know it yet, but her decision that day would change not just her life, but the lives of countless pilots who would fly the Mustangs she'd helped keep in the sky. The Japanese forces would indeed learn to fear those silver fighters, and part of that fear would be built rivet by by a small woman from Riverside, California, who refused to be underestimated. The story was just beginning. Part 2. Into the fire 3 months later, Maggie stood on the deck of a transport ship watching the coast of California disappear into the morning fog. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before her, gray and churning under an overcast sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, was the war. And now, finally, she was going toward it, instead of just reading about it in newspapers. The journey from Riverside to this moment had been a whirlwind. After Mr. Whitmore's recommendation, Maggie's application had moved swiftly through the Army Air Force's bureaucracy. She'd been accepted into the Civilian Advisor Program within 6 weeks. She'd undergone 2 weeks of intensive training at a facility near San Diego, learning military protocols, aircraft maintenance procedures specific to combat conditions, and basic survival skills. She'd also learned that she was one of only 12 women accepted into the program out of more than 300 applicants. The other 11 were scattered across different assignments. Maggie was heading to a forward air base in the Mariana Islands, where P-51 Mustangs were being deployed to escort long-range bombing missions over Japanese-held territory. Her mother had cried when Maggie told her, "First Tommy, now you," she'd said, gripping Maggie's hands. "I can't lose both my children." "You won't, Ma," Maggie had promised. "I'll be working on planes, not flying them. I'll be safe." It wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it. Anywhere near the combat zone was dangerous. Japanese submarines prowled these waters. Enemy aircraft sometimes raided American bases. But Maggie couldn't tell her mother the real reason she had to go. She couldn't explain the burning need to be part of something larger than herself, to prove that her skills mattered, to show that a woman could serve her country just as bravely as any man. The transport ship carried 200 personnel, pilots, mechanics, support staff, and a handful of civilian advisors like Maggie. Most of the military personnel ignored her. A few were openly curious. One pilot, a young lieutenant from Georgia named Jimmy Barnes, had sought her out the first day. "Ma'am," he'd said, tipping an imaginary hat, "I heard you're one of the technical advisors. That true?" "It's true," Maggie had replied, waiting for the inevitable condescension, but Jimmy had surprised her. "That's outstanding. We need more people who actually know these birds inside and out. I've seen too many mechanics who learned on the job and don't understand the fine points. Having someone from the factory? That's going to save lives." Not everyone shared Jimmy's enthusiasm. A master sergeant named Russo, who was in charge of the maintenance crews at their destination, made his feelings clear during a briefing on the second day of the voyage. "Let me make something plain. Russo had said, addressing the handful of civilian advisors in a cramped briefing room below deck. "You're here because someone in Wash." "Hand, yes?" Russo said, his tone suggesting he already regretted acknowledging her. "What if we see a critical safety issue? Something that could cause a plane to fail? Then you report it to me and I make the call." "Even if there's no time? Even if a plane is about to take off with a defect that could kill the pilot?" Russo's face had reddened. "Listen, sweetheart, it's Miss Sullivan. I don't care what it is. Here's how this works. I've been maintaining aircraft in combat conditions for 3 years. I've kept birds flying through conditions you can't imagine. I've lost men and I've saved men. And I'm not about to let some factory girl who's never heard a shot fired in anger start second-guessing my operation." The room had gone silent. Maggie felt every eye on her. She could back down, accept the humiliation, make things easier, or she could stand her ground. "Sergeant Russo," she'd said quietly, "I'm not here to second-guess anyone. I'm here because I've built these aircraft from the frame up. I know every rivet, every seam, every stress point. I know how they fail and why, and if my knowledge can prevent even one pilot from going down, then I'm going to speak up, whether you like it or not." Russo had stared at her for a long, hard moment. Then he'd turned to address the room. "Briefing's over. Get out!" Afterward, one of the other civilian advisors, a middle-aged man from Detroit named Carl, had pulled Maggie aside. "You've got guts," he'd said. "But you should know, Russo's going to make your life hell now." "He was going to make my life hell anyway," Maggie had replied. "At least this way he knows I won't be pushed around." Now, standing on the deck as the ship pushed deeper into the Pacific, Maggie wondered if she'd made the right choice. Carl was probably right. Russo had authority. He could marginalize her, ignore her, make sure her advice was never implemented. She'd come all this way, fought so hard, and she might end up sitting in a corner while men who knew less than she did made decisions that cost lives. The thought made her angry. But anger, Maggie had learned, could be useful. It could fuel determination. It could keep you going when everything else said to quit. "Miss Sullivan?" Maggie turned to find Jimmy Barnes approaching. He carried 2 tin cups of coffee. "Thought you might want something warm. Gets cold out here on the water." "Thank you, Lieutenant." Maggie accepted the coffee gratefully. "Call me Jimmy. We're not that formal in the fighter squadrons." He leaned on the railing beside her. "I heard about the run-in with Russo. News travels fast. Ship's not that big." Jimmy sipped his coffee. "For what it's worth, you handled it right. Russo's a good mechanic, but he's old school. Doesn't trust anyone he hasn't served with. Doesn't trust new methods. And he definitely doesn't trust women. I gathered that." "But here's the thing," Jimmy continued. "Russo answers to Major Kendrick, the base commander. And Kendrick cares about one thing, mission success. If you can prove your advice makes a difference, Kendrick will listen. Russo will have to fall in line." "How do I prove that?" Jimmy smiled. "By being right. By catching something the regular mechanics miss. By solving a problem they can't solve." He paused. "These Mustangs we're flying? They're incredible machines. Fastest, most maneuverable fighters we've got. But they're still new. We're learning their quirks in combat conditions. There have been issues, engine problems, fuel system glitches, things that don't show up in stateside testing. If you can help us fix those issues, you'll have more credibility than any formal authority could give you." Maggie looked out at the ocean, thinking, "I'll do my best. That's all any of us can do." Jimmy finished his coffee. "Get some rest, Miss Sullivan. We'll be at the base in 4 days. Then the real work begins." The Mariana Islands appeared on the horizon on a bright, hot morning. From the ship, Maggie could see the airfield, a long runway carved out of coral and rock, surrounded by tents and Quonset huts. Palm trees swayed in the wind. The island looked like paradise, but Maggie knew better. This was a forward combat base. Japanese forces still held islands within striking distance. The war was very, very real here. Disembarking was chaotic. Equipment had to be unloaded. Personnel had to be processed. Maggie grabbed her single duffel bag. Everything she owned fit in one bag now, and followed the other advisors to a processing tent. A corporal barely old enough to shave looked at her paperwork with confusion. "You're Sullivan." "Margaret Sullivan." That's right. But you're... He trailed off, clearly unsure how to finish the sentence. A woman. Yes. Is there a problem? No, ma'am. It's just... We were expecting... He shuffled papers nervously. Never mind. You're assigned to Hut 7. That's advisor's quarters. Sergeant Russo will brief you tomorrow at 0600. Hut 7 was a long, corrugated metal building divided into small rooms. Maggie's room contained a cot, a small table, a chair, and a locker. A single window looked out toward the airfield. She could see P-51s parked in neat rows, their silver bodies gleaming in the tropical sun. They looked beautiful and deadly. Maggie unpacked her few belongings. She had work clothes, a single dress she'd probably never wear, toiletries, and a stack of letters from her mother. She pinned a photograph of Tommy on the wall above her cot. He was in his Marine uniform, grinning at the camera. He looks so young. I'm here, Tommy, she whispered. I made it. That evening, she walked around the base, getting her bearings. The airfield was impressive. Hundreds of personnel, dozens of aircraft, constant activity. Maintenance crews worked on planes even as the sun set. Pilots gathered in groups, talking and laughing with the forced casualness of men who faced death regularly. Maggie noticed something else, too. The tension, the exhaustion. Men moved with purpose, but also with weariness. This wasn't like the factory back home, where you could go home at the end of your shift. Here, the work never ended. The danger never lifted. She was standing near the flight line, watching mechanics work on a Mustang's engine when someone spoke behind her. You lost? Maggie turned to find a short, stocky mechanic in his 30s watching her with suspicion. His name tape read Kowalski. No, Maggie said. Just observing. Observing. Kowalski spat into the dirt. You're the woman advisor, right? The one who thinks she's going to teach us our jobs? I'm here to help. We don't need help from someone who's never worked on a plane outside a factory. Kowalski gestured at the Mustang. You see that bird? She took flak over Iwo Jima. Pilot brought her home with half the tail shot away. We patched her up with what we had. No fancy tools. No perfect conditions. Just sweat and skill. That's real mechanic work. Not driving rivets in a nice, safe building. Maggie looked at the aircraft. She could see the repair work Kowalski mentioned. The patches were functional but crude. Effective but not optimal. She saw stress points that might become problems. She saw repairs that would work in the short term but could fail under the wrong conditions. But she also saw something else. She saw pride. Kowalski and his crew had kept this plane flying against enormous odds. They'd saved a pilot's life. They'd done it with limited resources and unlimited pressure. That deserved respect. You did good work, Maggie said quietly. You kept her flying. You brought a pilot home. That's what matters. Kowalski blinked, clearly surprised by her response. Yeah, well, that's the job. It is, Maggie agreed. And I'm not here to criticize or replace anyone. I'm here because I know these planes from a different angle. Maybe sometimes that knowledge can help. Maybe not, but I'm willing to learn from you just as much as you might learn from me. For a moment, Kowalski's hard expression softened slightly. Then he shook his head. Russo's going to eat you alive, you know that? I've been told. Russo doesn't just dislike women in the workplace. He thinks it's bad luck, thinks it undermines discipline. He's going to do everything he can to prove you don't belong here. Then I'll have to prove otherwise. Kowalski studied her for a moment longer, then shrugged. Your funeral. Come on, boys. We've got 3 more birds to service before midnight. As Maggie walked back to her quarters in the gathering darkness, she felt the weight of what she'd taken on settling onto her shoulders. These men were exhausted, overworked, and fighting a war against an enemy that would show no mercy. They didn't want complications. They didn't want uncertainty. They wanted to do their jobs and survive, and she was a complication, an uncertainty. A woman in a world that had no template for how to treat her, but she'd come too far to give up now. That night, lying on her cot and listening to the distant sound of waves and the closer sound of aircraft engines, Maggie made herself a promise. She would prove her worth. She would earn their respect. And she would do it the only way she knew how, through excellence, through determination, and through never, ever giving up. Tomorrow she would meet with Russo. Tomorrow. The real test would begin, but tonight she allowed herself to feel a moment of quiet pride. She'd made it to the war. She was here, on a tiny island in the vast Pacific, surrounded by men who doubted her, facing challenges she couldn't yet imagine. And she was ready. Part 3. Proving ground the next morning, Maggie reported to Sergeant Russo's office at exactly 0600. The sun was already hot, and the humidity made everything feel sticky. Russo sat behind a battered metal desk in a Quonset hut that served as maintenance headquarters. He didn't look up when she entered. "You're the Sullivan woman," he said, still studying a clipboard. "Yes, Sergeant." "Operations, I might allow you to offer observations. Understood?" Maggie kept her voice even. "Sergeant, I was sent here to provide technical expertise, not to observe for a week. There are planes that need attention right now." Russo finally looked up. His eyes were hard. "Miss Sullivan, this is a combat zone. My mechanics work under conditions you cannot imagine. They make split-second decisions that mean life or death. I will not have you disrupting their rhythm or second-guessing their judgment until you understand what they're dealing with. 1 week, that's not negotiable." Maggie felt frustration rising but forced it down. "Very well, Sergeant. Where should I start?" "Kowalski's crew." "Hangar 3, don't get in their way." Maggie spent that first day following Kowalski and his team as they serviced multiple P-51s. The work was brutal. In the tropical heat, the mechanics sweated through their clothes within an hour. They worked with limited tools and improvised solutions. They dealt with damage from combat, from the harsh environment, from simple wear and tear, and they worked fast. Planes had to be ready for missions. Pilots depended on them. There was no time for perfection, only for good enough. Maggie watched everything. She saw how they checked the Merlin engines, how they inspected the control surfaces, how they tested the guns. She saw their shortcuts and their clever fixes. And she saw the places where factory knowledge could help, but she kept quiet, as ordered. On the third day, she noticed something during a routine inspection. A Mustang had returned from a mission with minor damage, a few bullet holes in the tail section, nothing serious. Kowalski's crew patched the holes and declared the plane ready for the next day's mission. But Maggie saw something the crew had missed. One of the bullets had passed close to a structural spar. The spar wasn't damaged, but the stress on the aluminum around it had created tiny stress fractures, cracks so small they were almost invisible. In normal conditions, they wouldn't matter. But in combat, with the plane pulling high G maneuvers, those cracks could spread. The tail could fail. The pilot would die. Maggie stood there watching the crew finish their work. Russo's orders were clear. 1 week of silence. Don't disrupt the crews. Don't second guess, but a pilot's life was at stake. She walked over to Kowalski. "Excuse me, I need to show you something." Kowalski looked annoyed. "We're busy. What is it?" "This spar," Maggie pointed. "Look at the stress pattern around the bullet hole. See those fine lines?" Kowalski squinted. "I don't see anything." "You need the right angle and light." Maggie adjusted her position. "There, stress fractures, hairline cracks. They'll spread under load." Another mechanic, a young man named Davies, came over. "She's right. I can see them now. How'd we miss that?" "Because you're working too fast in bad light with inadequate equipment," Maggie said. "It's not your fault. But this plane can't fly tomorrow. That tail will fail." Kowalski's face darkened. "You're supposed to be observing, not telling us our jobs. I'm telling you that if this plane flies, the pilot will probably die. Do you want that on your conscience?" Before Kowalski could respond, a voice cut through the hangar. "What's going on here?" Sergeant Russo strode toward them, his face already red with anger. "Sullivan, I gave you specific instructions. 1 week of observation. No interference." "Sergeant, this plane has stress fractures that could cause structural failure." "I don't care." Russo's voice was flat and hard. "You violated direct orders." "Kowalski, is the plane airworthy?" Kowalski hesitated. Maggie could see the conflict in his face. He'd seen the cracks. He knew she was right. But contradicting Russo would have consequences. The cracks are pretty small, Sarge," Kowalski said finally. "They might spread, might not." "Might," Russo repeated. "In combat operations, we deal with might every single day. Every plane that goes up might not come back. We do our best with what we have, and we trust our mechanics' judgment." "Their judgment, Sullivan. Not yours," He turned to Kowalski. Is the plane safe to fly? Another hesitation. Then, reluctantly, yes, Sarge. Then it flies. Russo pointed at Maggie. You, come with me, now. In Russo's office, he rounded on her. You've been here 3 days, and you're already causing problems. I knew this would happen. I told the major that bringing civilians, especially women, into a combat operation was a mistake. Sergeant, those stress fractures are real. That plane could fail, or it could fly just fine, like hundreds of other planes with minor damage. We're fighting a war here, Sullivan. We can't ground every bird that has a tiny imperfection. We'd have no air cover at all. This isn't a tiny imperfection. This is a structural issue that could be catastrophic. And this is a combat zone where we make tough calls based on experience and necessity, not theoretical possibilities. Russo sat down heavily. I want you off my flight line. You're restricted to advisory duties only. Paperwork, training materials, things that don't involve actual aircraft. You'll stay away from my crews. You can't do that. I was sent here by the War Department, and I'm in command of maintenance operations on this base. Major Kendrick gave me authority over all civilian advisors. You've proven you can't follow orders. You're benched. Maggie felt her world collapsing. She'd come all this way, fought so hard, and now she was being shut out because she'd tried to save a pilot's life. The injustice of it burned like acid. What if I'm right? She asked quietly. What if that plane fails and the pilot dies? Will you still think you made the right call? For just a moment, she saw doubt flicker across Russo's face. Then it hardened again. Dismissed, Sullivan. Maggie walked out of that office feeling numb. She'd failed. Not because she was wrong, but because the system wouldn't let her be right. Because men like Russo valued their authority more than they valued the truth. She went back to her quarters and sat on her cot, staring at Tommy's photograph. What would he say? What would he do? She knew the answer. Tommy would tell her to keep fighting, to find another way, to never give up. That night, Maggie couldn't sleep. She lay awake, thinking about the P-51 with the stress fractures, thinking about the pilot who would fly it. She didn't know his name. She'd probably never meet him. But he was someone's son, someone's brother, maybe someone's father. He mattered. At 0300, she made a decision. It was probably the wrong decision. It would probably get her sent home in disgrace. But she had to try. She got dressed, slipped out of her hut, and made her way to the flight line. Security was light. This was an American base on an American-held island. The real threat was from the air or sea, not from within. She found the Mustang in question. It was fueled and armed, ready for the morning mission. Using a flashlight and working quickly, she examined the stress fractures again. They were definitely there. And in the hours since she'd first seen them, they'd grown slightly. The metal was failing. Maggie looked around. No one was watching. She could walk away. Follow orders. Let fate decide, or she could act. She found Kowalski's toolkit. He always left it near his assigned aircraft. She pulled out a grease pencil and wrote directly on the tail section, circling the stress fractures. Critical failure risk. Do not fly. M. Sullivan. Then she went back to her quarters and waited for dawn. The explosion of anger came at 0630. Russo stormed into her hut without knocking. What the hell did you do? I marked a critical safety issue. You vandalized military property. You countermanded my orders. I could have you arrested. Then arrest me. But don't send that plane up. Russo's face was purple with rage. Major Kendrick wants to see you. Now. Major Thomas Kendrick was in his 40s, tall and lean with the weathered look of a career officer. His office was Spartan but neat. When Maggie entered with Russo, Kendrick was standing by a window, looking out at the flight line. Miss Sullivan, he said without turning around. Sergeant Russo tells me you've become a problem. Sir, I identified a structural defect that poses a serious risk to pilot safety. I reported it through proper channels. When my concern was dismissed, I felt I had no choice but to take direct action. Now Kendrick turned. His eyes were sharp and assessing. Sergeant Russo, you're dismissed. Wait outside. Russo looked shocked. Sir, this is a maintenance matter. I said wait outside, Sergeant. When Russo left, Kendrick sat down and gestured for Maggie to do the same. Tell me about these stress fractures. Everything you know. Maggie explained the metallurgy, the stress patterns, the propagation rates under different conditions. She spoke clearly and precisely, using her factory knowledge to paint a picture of exactly what would happen if that plane flew under combat conditions. Kendrick listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I had the plane inspected by our senior structural engineer. He confirmed your assessment. Those fractures would likely cause catastrophic failure during high-G maneuvers. The pilot would have had no chance." Relief washed over Maggie. "Then the plane's been grounded?" "It's being repaired properly. It won't fly until it's safe." Kendrick leaned back. "You saved a pilot's life, Miss Sullivan." "Lieutenant Michael Chen. He has a wife and a baby daughter he's never met. Thanks to you, he might get to meet her." "I just did what was right, sir." "Yes, you did. Which brings us to the problem." Kendrick's expression grew stern. "You also violated direct orders from your supervisor. You undermined military authority, and you acted unilaterally in a way that